recording.
Yeah, so what we'll do is we'll post it online on our website, the Presley Center. I can send you that link afterwards if you want it for your students. Yep.
I don't know if they would want it.
Right. But I'll make it available. Yep, yep. So just remind me if I forget to do that, or Justine can do it too. You know, either of us to do that. And then we'll do a Q&A at the end. So you can field questions, and then if there's questions from online, they'll.
Yeah, that's
Kevin told
Kevin.
Okay,
Yeah,
great.
good. Makes sense.
Right. Perfect. Okay. So I think it will start. Let me introduce you real quick.
Okay.
So thanks everyone for coming and attending and supporting the Presley Center events. So I'm happy to introduce Dr. Michael Campbell, who's an associate professor in the Department of Sociology and Criminology at the University of Denver. His research examines the social, historical, and political forces that shape law and policy. And much of his career has been specifically focused on mass incarceration, and I would say decarceration to some extent. Dr. Campbell's work has been published in top research journals, including the American Journal of Sociology, Law and Society Review, Criminology, Punishment Society, and elsewhere. In addition, he's also been the recipient of various grants and awards for his scholarship, including the National Science Foundation and Russell Sage Foundation as well. So the format today will be, he will present his talk, and then we'll have time at the end for Q&A. So you just raise your hand when we're finished, and then we will field the questions. He will field the questions. So join me in welcoming Dr. Campbell.
Okay, well, thank you very much. I'd like to thank everybody here at the center for having me here today to talk about my research on mass incarceration, part of a broader project. Obviously, doing a lot of great things here. You have Professor Oslin in charge, known her for a long time. So somebody's making good decisions around here. I know that already. Today, what I'll be talking about is essentially one of the first papers, or one of the first products that have been generated by a much bigger research project that I've been working on for quite some time. And so I'll give you a quick overview here of what we'll be covering. As first, I'm going to give a brief. I'm going to assume that lots of folks here already know some basics about mass incarceration and what I'm talking about, but I am going to give a kind of a quick overview of the parts of mass incarceration that are most central to the research questions I'll be talking about today. Then I'll give a brief overview of the broader project that I've been engaged in for many years at this point. The name of the project is called the Changing Tides Project on Mass Incarceration. Then I'm going to talk about the early 21st century, which is the part of the project that I'll be presenting the results of today for everyone. And then I'll talk about some of the key findings that focus on the roles that governors play, the roles that penal administrators play, and the importance of state institutional structures that operate at the back end of the criminal justice systems in the states we've studied that were important in shaping the ways that those states responded to some of the crises of incarceration in the 21st century. And then lastly, I'll return at the end to talk about some of the implications of this research, and hopefully these phrases about autonomy and expertise in political context then will make some sense. So I'm sharing here just briefly, again, as I said, mass incarceration is something that most everyone knows something about, but this chart just gives you a sense of the kind of some of the historical trajectory of changes in incarceration rates in the United States. And as we can see from the chart here, we have in the US a relatively long period of stability in terms of incarceration rates in the US that begins to change in the late 1960s in some states, but by the early 1970s and in 1974, the overall US incarceration rate begins to tick up. And as we can see here from the graph, this upward trend is very sharp. And the reason I shared this graph is, if you can see here, it's a little bit off the page, but the darker orange rate there just shows you essentially the share of incarceration that's actually attributable to state correctional systems. So we see here that jails do matter. Jails are in the middle. At the bottom, we see other things, but the federal system. But the main incarcerating kind of entity in the United States operates at the state level. So state prison systems are actually, when we talk about mass incarceration, we're talking about state level correctional systems that are really a key part of that. Well, especially since the events in 2020 that led to widespread questions about criminal justice policy and about the wisdom of mass incarceration and about the racial implications and overall issues of justice associated with criminal justice policy. There's been a lot of questions about what can we do to actually address these social issues. So for today, part of what I wanted to focus on was to bring a little bit of kind of perspective as from my view and from kind of a scholarly perspective, where are some of the places and what are some of the things that can actually happen in terms of criminal justice reforms that might help us move away from policies and practices that put so many people in prison. A lot of research, and I'm not going to focus on this, but there's large bodies of research that have outlined the human, fiscal, and social costs of mass incarceration, which in the US are massive. They don't just affect the millions of people who have been incarcerated. They also affect the tens of millions of people who are family members and people who have been affected in many ways by putting so many people in prison for such a long time. And the fiscal costs of incarceration are in the billions of dollars and in the tens and even hundreds of billions of dollars as we look back with kind of a longer lens at the historical trajectories of Americans' use of imprisonment. And we also look at the social costs, right? So the social costs of incarcerating so many people doesn't fall equally across all Americans. It falls heavily and disproportionately upon those people who have historically been marginalized in the United States, especially people of color, African Americans in particular. African American men have been vastly disproportionately affected by incarceration. And so their families, their communities, their states, all of these costs have weighed heavily on our nation. And by the time we get to the 21st century, the reason for this project is that by the time we get to the 21st century, this is really the beginning of kind of serious steps or the serious consideration of moves away from the types of policies and practices that had created what we now call mass incarceration. In other words, putting people in prison on a massive scale, a scale unlike the scale of the use of imprisonment in any other democratic country in the world, by a magnitude of 5 to 10. We compare ourselves to places like the United Kingdom or Canada, or even with France or Australia, countries we often compare ourselves to. So by the time we get to the 21st century, there is the beginning of rethinking how wise is it to use prison as a first resort, to use it as often as we do, and to use such severe sentencing as we do. And as you can see here in the middle, if we think about the types of reforms that emerge, I put a question mark after sentencing. And the reason that I do that is because sentencing is actually one of the first and kind of most logical things we might think of if we were going to reduce how many people we have in our prisons, right? The idea might be that we would sentence fewer people to go to prison at all. And that when we do send people to prison, we might start sending them there for shorter periods of time. Well, sentencing, as I'll briefly discuss, has not been a very successful kind of terrain for implementing reform. But by the 21st century, by around between 2000 and 2005, people are starting to at least talk about how ramping up sentences the way that was so common in the 1990s probably isn't that wise. Also by this period, when we talk about parole, this is a period when parole begins to be reconsidered. So throughout the 1990s, there were many people who had essentially decided that parole was no longer really a good way to go about dealing with people who were being released from prison. So things like discretionary parole were being abandoned in the interest instead of locking people up and keeping them there in prison for the long duration of their sentence and not giving them the opportunity to leave prisons as often, and then also sending them back much sooner. And then thirdly, another area of reform that became a more realistic discussion, area for discussion was simply diverting people from going to prison at all. There are many people who were recognizing that putting people in prison at all really doesn't do a lot to improve public safety, at least when it's not targeted to specific populations that are very high risk. And that we know that when we do send people there, this doesn't improve their long-term outcomes. It actually is not a good idea. So diversion became a more popular area of discussion for reform. And so by the time we get to the 21st century, and you see, I can not see quite all of the side of the slide there, but the idea here is the state incarceration rates begin to wobble and change for the first time since the early 1970s and 1980s. By the time that we get to the 21st century, we have states that are thinking seriously about whether this is a good idea and are actually acting upon their doubts about the wisdom of putting so many people in prison. So from 2001 to 2013, 4 US states have reductions in the overall size of their prison population and their state incarceration rates that exceed 20% of their overall state population. So this is good news, right? So for a topic that is so often very depressing, the reality of this, there is good news. By the 21st century, we have 4 states that made a real change. Now, I'm not going to give California, even though I'm here and you all are at the University of California, too much credit, because California was forced to do this by federal courts and was dragged to the altar to this marriage of taking people out of prison, despite the fact that the state's prison system had failed so miserably in dealing with the health care of their inmates. So California didn't do this much by choice. It was forced to do it, but it did it in the end. These other states, they reduced their prison populations because they made changes in policies and changes in practices that led to these declines. So a more proactive move. At the same time, 4 states in the United States, Minnesota, Indiana, Pennsylvania, and Florida, had increases of incarceration rates that were over 20% in just 12 years. Now, mind you, by 2001, these state prison populations and incarceration rates in these states were already very, very high. Those states had already had imprisonment rates that had been growing for decades. And still, by 2000, those states still sustained policy trajectories, imprisonment trajectories that saw increases in their incarceration rates in excess of 20%. So pretty remarkable, right? By 2000, we had history, we had more knowledge about incarceration, and yet we still have many states doing things that lead to increases. So we have variation. So one, I think, good place to start in talking about incarceration and reform for incarceration is where can we change things that might reduce prison populations? Where are the sources? Where are the leverage points in the process of American governance where one might be able to change these problems? So if we think of the federal level, and this is going to be a quick and dirty examination of these things, but when we look at the federal level, as I mentioned, the courts have taken some actions that have been meaningful. Especially for California and Brown v. Plata, where the state was forced to reduce its prison population. Many of those people that were in state prison were then funneled back to more local jail-like facilities that we might even call state jails, kind of like what they have in Texas. Congress is another place where we could have reforms that would change. Congress played a central role in helping expand incarceration in the United States by providing large amounts of funding to the states and allowing those states to choose how they would use those resources. Many states chose to use those resources to increase sentencing and to build more prisons. And of course, the executive branch could play a role in changing these things by shifting priorities for federal law enforcement, by being more rigorous in the ways they investigate prison conditions in the United States, thus making it a little more difficult for states to incarcerate people in difficult and often inhumane and unconstitutional conditions. So there are leverage points at the federal level. But for the most part, the federal level hasn't been a place where a lot of reforms happen. A lot of current considerations over, I'd say, the last 5 years about criminal justice reform and incarceration have happened more at the local level, where people have started thinking more seriously about the roles of prosecutors. So many scholars have started to focus more and more on understanding the role that prosecutors play in deciding whether to charge people with crimes, what crimes we charge them with, and then pursuing how aggressively that they would pursue those charges. So we've seen in the course of many elections in the recent past that people have elected in more in certain areas that have tried to move away from mass incarceration, places like Philadelphia, places in California that have, as we know, those things that have ebbed and flowed in terms of support for more prosecutors that are critical of incarceration, places like Tampa, Florida. Prosecutorial elections are a place where important inroads can be made by electing people to office who focus more on the most serious violent crimes and are less likely to pursue charges that put more people in prison. Local programs can also rely more on probation than they rely on incarceration, right? So diverting people from the harshest punishments. Also, policing priorities can shift, right? Rather than focusing on kind of apprehending, charging, and incarcerating people for some of the mid-tier kind of drug dealing cases that contributed to a lot of the rise in incarceration in the 1980s and 90s. Police can focus their resources more on community-style policing that is targeting violence reduction rather than surveillance and apprehension. So policing can and does matter. And also overall sentencing decisions, which also fall to the hands of judges and to juries in terms of what sorts of sentences are handed down when people are convicted of crimes. Well, the place where most of my talk and my interest will focus is on state level processes, because it's at the state level that governments have a lot of power based on the structure of American federalism. Sentencing policies are established by legislatures. Legislatures and governors work together to establish how the correctional administration will be run and funded. And executive branches, the governor's offices, play an important role in managing and administering prisons and have a lot of power, as we'll see, in determining how these things work. Well, the broader project, and I'll get through this quickly, that I've been engaged in since about 2014, and I worked with Heather Schoenfeld, who's at the University of Boston University. Our broader project, aims to understand and study incarceration by studying and focusing on state level changes, state level processes, since they are such an essential site for understanding what goes on with mass incarceration. And so in this project that we've been working on since 2014, the name Changing Tides should probably have a question mark after it actually. Are the tides changing in terms of the national commitment to mass incarceration? So we identify these changes in incarceration rates. We identify the variation. We said, are the tides turning? Are things changing? Is there something new going on here? So this project aims to figure that out. And it aims to do so by leveraging the fact that states vary so much, as I showed you in a couple slides ago, that state incarceration rates are quite different from one state to the other. And those differences are partly the product of laws and policies implemented by state governments. There are other things, but state governments do matter. And another part of our project was designed specifically, as I'll show in a moment, to also leverage and try to study and understand the ways that these things differ across regions. And then lastly, the methodological approach that we're employing in our project is kind of the wide scale collection of qualitative data, including the broad collection of media sources, quotations, information on the trajectory of penal policies and the politics that are associated with it. We've collected an enormous amount of legislative material about the types of bills that have been proposed, the types of processes that have unfolded that have shaped those legislative processes, government reports, and then a lot of interviews with people who were actually there and actually involved and engaged in the processes that led to policy. And ultimately, then our methods are primarily targeting the actors and organizations that shape penal policy, not so much the people that implement those policies and not so much the people who are actually affected by them. So we're focused in trying to understand then what's going on in the states, who's creating these policies. Well, this chart shows you that the project was designed where we created 3 sets of match paired states that we conducted intensive case studies of each of these states. So in the Midwest, we studied Michigan and Illinois, and our logic was that we identified neighboring states because they share more similarities than differences in terms of their histories of politics, often their demographic and socioeconomic trends. So in the Midwest, we selected Michigan and Illinois to relatively large states that have good sized populations who had variation in terms of their penal trajectories. Michigan made significant reductions in their incarceration rates over this period, while incarceration rates in Illinois continue to climb. Similarly, we chose New Jersey and Pennsylvania. It's not always easy to pick a region for these two states, more northeastern than our other states, but more mid-Atlantic as well. So New Jersey, much like Michigan, has implemented reforms. Pennsylvania, much like Illinois, is not. But these two are neighboring states that have a lot of commonalities. They have a lot of socioeconomic similarities in terms of their crime rates over time, kind of their economic structures, and demographic trends. So no two states are the same, but we do our best to control for these things by picking neighboring states that have more in common than if we picked random states, right? So more in common than Texas or Idaho or other states. And in the South, for the same reasons, we picked Georgia and Florida. So Georgia did implement some criminal justice reforms, while Florida did not. Now, I won't be talking today much about Georgia and Florida because during this period that I'll be looking at and talking about, these two states didn't engage in any serious or meaningful criminal justice reforms that kind of fit the criteria of interest for us today. And while you might say, oh, well, why not explain that? That's another talk. That'll be another article, but that's not something I'm going to cover today. We also began kind of going through our data by identifying which time period to start with. And of course, it makes sense when you're doing historical analysis to start with the beginning. So we began looking, since our time frame was the 21st century, we started off looking here at this period around 2000 to around 2007. And again, these aren't hard barrier years, but in the ballpark. And so the idea then was we wanted to address a series of research questions that you can see there that start to get at who is driving reform and where does it happen? What does that reform look like? Part of the reason for choosing this time frame is that there are important changes that occurred. Heather and I had worked together and we had written an article where we argued that by the 1990s to early 2000, the kind of mindset, or what scholars call the carceral ethos that had become more deeply entrenched, had become largely a bipartisan product or project. The Democratic Party, the Bill Clinton presidency and administration, there was a lot of unanimity in terms of what these policies should look like and what kind of an approach that was best for responding to crime. And that was kind of a prisons first mindset. And so what we wanted to understand is how do these things unfold in the state in this very early period. As I said, the talk today will focus on the two matched pairs of Michigan, Illinois, and New Jersey and Pennsylvania, because as I said, Georgia and Florida really don't fit our criteria here for engaging in some of these earliest reforms that we wanted to understand. So this chart then gives you a sense here, more focused than the broad kind of explanation here, to give you a more focused sense as to just how much these prison populations have grown. Now note, this is 1990 here, right? So the other chart I showed you was a much longer historical time frame. This chart begins in 1990. So when we're talking about changes in policies and kind of changes for institutions, imagine if I told you, for example, that college enrollment rates in these states went up by the proportions. If we put another zero behind these over the course of a mere 10 years, you would say, my God, what an amazing accomplishment in each of these states. This is a massive increase in such a short period of time. What sorts of policies drove such a sharp increase? Well, this is part of what we're trying to understand. As you can see here, to varying degrees, all of these states' prison populations were going up by the time we get to 2000, the point where our work here will start to address. As you can see, though, we have considerable variation. Our two neighbors here at the bottom, New Jersey and Pennsylvania, which Pennsylvania is in the purple, New Jersey in the green. As you can see, there's a big departure between those two states that happens in the late 1990s and early 2000s, which is a part of what we were looking to understand. And then when we look at the other states, we see that they do have these sharp increases, and yet eventually, partly due to just the sheer size of their prison populations and the costs associated with them, those increases start to decline, though, of course, as you can see in the graph, not in Pennsylvania. So some people have argued, of course, that the rise in the prison populations was simply a reflection of rising rates of violent crime in the United States. Well, as you can see from this chart, the 1990s, from 1990 to about 2004, incarceration or violent crime rates in the United States went through one of the biggest, historically most significant drops in the history of the country. Violent crime rates dropped by 50% between 1990 and 2003. They dropped across all states in the country. They declined in all types of cities and across all demographics, some more than others. But the decline was one of major historical significance. And so if you think about the previous chart and you think about the way that incarceration is going up, you might say, well, it's working, right? We're putting a whole bunch of people in prison and crime is going down. Well, one of the values of doing comparisons across state is that crime was declining the most in the places where incarceration was actually declining. So places like New York and New Jersey simultaneously made major reductions to their incarceration rates, but also had some of the biggest, most significant declines in violent crime. So also in looking at our 4 states here, Michigan and New Jersey, Pennsylvania and Illinois, one of the popular explanations for incarceration rates has always been that this has become such a politicized project that it's partly explained by partisan politics, that Republicans were early champions of putting more people in prison. Democrats have at times been complicit as well in taking a prison first mindset, but that Republicans having power is usually going to equate to more people in prison, Democrats to less. Well, that wasn't largely true in the 1990s, where Democrats were also involved, and in other periods as well, depending on the region, where Democrats were very active agents in building large prison systems. But when we start to look here at the period of concern that I'll be talking about or discussing here, you can see that we have more variety. We have Democratic governors in Michigan and Illinois, Republicans in New Jersey and Pennsylvania. And the chart here starts to show that one of the things that we began to do is we constructed memoranda where we outlined the trajectories of the policies and reform initiatives that were associated with changes in incarceration rates. We started to look, okay, who are the people that are initiating these changes? Who are the people that are supporting or opposing or driving these changes? And then who are the people who are actually engaged in making these things happen? And as we can see here, we didn't set out to study the role of penal administrators in shaping state incarceration rates. As we analyzed our data, what we found, which we didn't expect or anticipate, was that penal administrators were actually playing an important role in some cases, as the title of the presentation suggests. Well, we have 2 states where there were major reforms that occurred in the period of interest that I'm talking about here today. In Michigan and New Jersey, both states made serious changes to state policies that help explain why their trajectories look different than the trajectories of Illinois and Pennsylvania. In Michigan, part of the story in Michigan is that Michigan's economy was so tightly bound to the auto industry that when the auto industry's fortunes really began to suffer in a very severe way around 2000 and 1990 to 2000, Michigan's economy was actually already contracting before the recession of 2001 hits. And I'll come back because the recession in 2001 is a very significant factor in this story. But that recession of 2001, which often gets lost because the terrorist attacks of September 11 often have overshadowed historically, really understanding the fact that the US did deal with a relatively severe economic recession that had a pretty important impact on state politics and state budgets during this period. And this sometimes gets overlooked, but that recession began before 9/11 happened. And then 9/11 happened and then the recession ended a few months later. But Michigan was already bound to some very challenging economic times, and state politics were understandably being very much shaped by those economic challenges. Part of that then is also associated with the election of a Democratic governor for the first time in several election cycles. Michigan voters elected Jennifer Granholm to be the first, I believe, the first female governor and the first Democrat in many years. And Governor Granholm played a very important role in making some changes. Governor Granholm was a former prosecutor Her campaign for governor was run very much on kind of a status quo thinking about criminal justice. She was not crusading as a big criminal justice reformer. As a former prosecutor, she was not an easy candidate to attack as being soft on crime or any of these sorts of things. But when Governor Granholm came into office, she immediately recognized that correctional spending was increasing at a rate that was simply unsustainable, and that the state budget simply had to be addressed in many different ways. And one of those had to be in the ways that the state was spending so much money on its correctional system, and especially on its prisons. So as part of the way that she dealt with this, she restructured the state's parole board when she took office, and her administration also created the Michigan Reentry Program, MPRI for short, which essentially ramped up and kind of made a much more serious push to generate more robust efforts to help people that were leaving prison leave prison, avoid technical violations, and to keep those people from going back to prisons. So for those of you who know much about parole, many of the people who are going into prison, being committed to prison, are being committed because they've committed technical violations of their parole. Part of, for California, I know this was around 70% when I was living here in grad school, of people being sent back to prison that were parolees hadn't committed new crimes. They committed technical violations. It was pretty high. I think it was that high. So part of the goal here was to take seriously the role that parole might be able to play in reducing the state's prison population. And so to do that, she essentially approached parole at the beginning of the parole process in terms of the parole board itself in granting parole. And then secondly, when people were out on parole, providing more resources to keep them from returning to prison. Also, and importantly, Michigan's changes were not driven by the state legislature, and they were not part of some sort of big political push to reduce the size of the state's prison population. When we think of reform, at least when I think of reform, part of what we thought we would find in this project was that we would find the introduction of bills that were aimed at reducing prison populations and acknowledging this won't work forever. We can't keep putting more and more people in prison. So we assume we'd find legislators propose bills, made compromises in a democracy, right? Enacted legislation that maybe not everybody loved, but gradually brought prison populations down. That's not what we find. Legislation played very little role here. Instead, the governor's office in Michigan is one of the more robust administrative offices for a governorship of any state in the country. And the governor was able to do a lot of these things without getting approval from the state legislature. And she enacted these. Obviously, there's political risk with taking these sorts of administrative moves. Now, our other state here that enacted major reforms was New Jersey, and things happened a little bit differently. By the time we get to 2000, period of interest here, mass incarceration had generated a lot of new problems and dilemmas. I talked with Michigan about costs, the sheer costs of putting so many people in prison and keeping them there and doing it in a constitutional way, again, which all states struggled with. While California was known for struggling with healthcare, Michigan was known for serving inmates foods that had maggots in it, and they couldn't seem to overcome that problem for years. Until they finally found a vendor that could serve food that was above kind of pet food quality. Michigan couldn't get away from this problem. New Jersey had a different problem. New Jersey's parole system and prison systems were so overcrowded that they had a parole backlog that was unconstitutional. The state constitution required that when people's parole date comes up, that they have a parole hearing. There were thousands of people who were still in prison in New Jersey who were sitting there unable to even get a parole hearing to have the chance to leave prison, even though this was unconstitutional. So in Hawker v. Consovoy, the state reached an agreement. This was a very quick and easy federal case. Several inmates got a lawyer who essentially went to federal court and very quickly was able to negotiate an agreement with the state where the state agreed to reduce and eliminate this backlog very quickly. The other problem in New Jersey is that this backlog had also led to the state prison system having to essentially outsource state incarceration to local jails, something that happened in many states. And so you had the state government essentially paying counties to jail state prisoners, which also had constitutionally wobbly justifications. but also was becoming unsustainably expensive. At some point, these costs exceeded over $100 million, and state lawmakers began to realize that this too was unsustainable, and especially this was intensified after the recession. As part of the changes that happened in New Jersey, there was a serious reconsideration of parole, and I'll talk in a moment about how they restructured their parole system. But there was a real effort to bring in new people with new ways of thinking about parole, and I'll talk about that in a moment. And part of that was also an expanded investment in reentry. Much like Michigan, people in New Jersey began to realize we have to do something to keep people who are leaving prison from coming back. Also, much like Michigan, these two states that were actually reform states, there was no major legislation passed during this time period that made any major reductions in the length of time that anybody was being sent to prison, right? So in my mind, as we think about what might help contribute to reducing prison population, an obvious place, as I said in the beginning, to start would be reducing sentences, the number of people sentenced to prison, the number of people and the amount of time that they're going there. Well, neither of these two states that actually made changes did that. So I've included some quotes here. Part of the project is we've interviewed a very large number of people who are actually engaged in the system. We interviewed politicians, we collect newspaper articles, and these quotes come from our interviews with some of these folks, and they also come from some of the statements that they made in the press. But as you can see, for these folks from Michigan, one of the people in the Granholm administration said that the mindset had been fail them, nail them, and jail them. This had been the approach to parole that this person was talking about, had been so problematic for the state. And so part of the idea here was trying to find a way during the Granholm administration, again, one that was not focused on trying to do a lot of criminal justice reforms during the election, but quickly found that this was necessary, started to recognize that this approach, fail them, nail them, and jail them, wasn't going to work. And so Governor Granholm decided then to come in and bring in reform-minded penal administrators. We have plenty of evidence in our interviews and our data of penal administrators who viewed their role in the Department of Corrections in a very narrow sense, that their job was simply to detain, to incarcerate, and to provide security for staff and for inmates. Not everyone viewed their role in the Department of Corrections in those types of terms. And so some of the penal administrators that Governor Granholm brought in, as you can see in the second quote, in the 90s, essentially with the big prison buildup when the state opened so many new prisons, we felt our job as far as the population was to predict what it was going to be, which the predictions were easy. We saw the chart straight up, right? The prediction was we need more prisons for money, so we had enough beds. We didn't think that we had any control at all, but we had a lot more control than we thought we did. Part of that control, of course, was contingent on the support of the governor. Governor Granholm didn't appoint just anyone to run the Department of Corrections. She appointed someone that she entrusted to help change the mindset from fail them, nail them, and jail them to thinking about different things that they could do. And in another interview here, as I said, when we talk about the role of legislation, one person who was a prominent figure in the correctional administration of the state during this period said everything they did without legislation. The legislature simply wasn't a viable path for reform. And another big obstacle to reform has often been the law enforcement lobby, whether it be the Sheriff's Association, the Prosecutors Association, Chiefs of Police. For many of those folks involved in law enforcement, the challenge, of course, for them is that they go through the process of trying to reduce crime, arresting people, jailing people if people are convicted. It's very discouraging for people in law enforcement that the idea that these people would be immediately reduced or returned to the population without much punishment. They have been among the most prominent, powerful, and significant opponents to criminal justice reforms that would reduce prison populations. Clearly, the administration understood that, and part of their policy was that they made exceedingly clear that our goal was to reduce violations, reduce returns, and reduce criminal activity, not eliminate it. So when you're talking about managing something like parole, it obviously comes with great risks. Many of our interviews, people are, I don't want to be the parole officer. I don't want my department to be the one to let someone out who does something horrible. And now we're in the news because we're the people that made these terrible decisions. So part of this, the administration understood that there had to be an effort to acknowledge that there was going to be resistance from law enforcement, but at least acknowledging these. And as a former prosecutor herself, Governor Granholm was able to take these concerns seriously and at least address them. New Jersey had some similar thinking along these lines, where in the wake of the federal lawsuit, the Governor Whitman, she also, I think New Jersey's first female governor, acknowledged and recognized that the state, oh, hit the wrong button. I got two different things going on here. Here we go. So in New Jersey, Governor Whitman, some of her staff that she brought in, she recognized that there had to be changes to parole in the state of New Jersey because of the problems with the parole board, the problems that they had to manage with the federal litigation. And this quote comes from the person that she named to be the new head of the New Jersey parole system and manage the parole board. And this is a quote from a person who had spent much of their life working as a parole officer, managing, being a manager and director of the parole system, who had essentially operated largely in the margins. But with this new administration, with these new problems generated by mass incarceration, this person now finds herself being shifted, as you can see from these quotes, into the forefront of operating, managing, and actually fully restructuring the Division of Parole and partly the Department of Corrections. And so all of a sudden, he says, all of a sudden they looked to us for ways to show off to the governor that they knew what they were doing, essentially taking approaches that moved away from the first impulse to simply lock more and more people up and to fail people at parole. And the second quote also, they wanted to professionalize, this is the exact word, they wanted to professionalize parole. I was stunned, frankly, because that's the essence of what I've stood for my whole life. So this was a person, again, who had worked their way up through parole, who had always been engaged with and interested in these ideas that had not been in fashion. But with the Whitman administration at the end of the 1990s and going into the early 2000s, folks in New Jersey were thinking in different ways. And so you can see then from this timeline that this kind of gives you a timeline of our reform state. So here we can see that there were some very significant historical forces at work. In 2001, as I said, we have a major recession. We have the 9/11 terrorist attacks. Now I put that up there because things that were very different prior to 9/11 in terms of the political focus on street crime in the United States. It was constantly a source of important political focus. But after the attacks of 9/11, a lot of the even domestic political discussions shifted more to a concern about security and terrorism and away from the kind of intense focus that had been a part of talking about street crime. I can also probably add here that another factor was that the crime rates, as we saw in one of the previous charts, had declined so significantly and for so long, and that those declines had happened in states where prison populations had leveled off and began to decline. And so there were many new kind of historical moments that kind of opened windows up at the beginning of the 21st century that made things a little bit different than they had been in the 1990s. And so then, as you can see here, we have these changes that I've just discussed that happen where prison administrators or correctional administrators had played important roles in essentially starting up, energizing, reshaping these institutions, and essentially expanding back-end processes associated with parole and reentry in ways that, as you can see on the very last part of the timeline, had very important implications. Those state prison populations declined significantly in the wake of this period. They weren't all attributable to changes in the parole board or to expanding reentry, but part of what we're seeing, and I won't cover it today, but as a bit of a teaser, if you look at these states' trajectory moving forward, once states embark on some effort of reform, part of what we're seeing is that it initiates cultural shifts and it generates momentum that has long-term important implications for the way that those states approach correctional processes. and in these states in ways that lead to even more major reforms. So down the road, both Michigan and New Jersey end up being two states that end up with bipartisan support in many cases, passing reforms that are some of the biggest ones that have happened, such as New Jersey's complete abolition of cash bail. Well, if we look at our two status quo states where essentially these states stayed on the path of mass incarceration that had become so common in the 1990s, we see something different. First, we wanted to understand the way that historical forces shape these changes. Well, one was Pennsylvania simply, if you look at the numbers and what happened in the state, Pennsylvania has a more diverse and had a more robust economy. Didn't have kind of the same degree of kind of Rust Belt problems with state budgets and the state economy as some of our other states. And so in Pennsylvania, the crisis of the state budget, it mattered. It was there, but it didn't garner the same type of political focus that it did in some of our other states, and especially as it did in Michigan. We also know that in Pennsylvania, the prosecutors remained a very powerful political force who remained in staunch opposition to the types of reforms that might have led to declines in the prison population. And we also know that there were Republicans. A former prosecutor, a senator named Greenleaf, was one of the most prominent kind of advocates for criminal justice reform. He had been a big supporter of ramping up sentencing in the 80s and 90s. He had been engaged in actively prosecuting criminals and sending them to prison. But by 2000, he was starting to rethink the wisdom of this approach, seeing that prison populations were so overcrowded and questioning whether this was the right path forward. So there was some support among Republicans. The problem was in the state that this level of support really didn't expand in a way that it did in some of the other cases we see, as in New Jersey, where moderate Republicans were more willing to accept things and where the law enforcement lobby wasn't quite as powerful. But one of the most important findings from our study is that the state structures of these two states played a really important role in limiting the options that people had. Much of that has to do with the fact that neither Illinois nor Pennsylvania had discretionary parole processes. Both of these states eliminated discretionary parole, meaning that essentially when an inmate goes to prison, the system has more flexibility in determining that that person under certain conditions can be released. In both Pennsylvania and Illinois, most of the people serving longer sentences in those states are going to stay in prison, and there aren't many institutional levers available to let them out. So in the two states with most changes, we had that kind of flexibility because those states retained some of that back-end flexibility. In these two states, they didn't. Instead, in Pennsylvania, they introduced a program, it was called the SIP program. I'll get to what the acronym means in a minute, but essentially this was a program that aimed to divert some of the lower level offenders that had been sent to prison. Think low level property offenders, mid-level drug offenders, divert them from prison, provide an alternative where these people would serve their time in local communities instead of going to prison. So the efforts in Pennsylvania focused on front-end reforms, and I'll explain how that was problematic in the long run. In Illinois, for those of you who aren't as old as I am or around that, you'll remember that in Illinois, politics were focused on problems of wrongful conviction. There were studies showing, and the journalism school at the University of Northwestern University, had shown that there were more people on death row in Illinois had been exonerated by DNA evidence than had been executed. That the state of Illinois was getting it wrong so often that there was no way to be confident in running that state, that they were executing people who weren't actually innocent of their crimes. This occupied a lot of the political discussion about criminal justice in the state. And ultimately, the Republican governor ended up commuting the death sentences of everybody on death row in the state of Illinois. Doing so opened this Republican governor up to the political kind of accusations of being soft on crime. So from what we've seen, we suspect that that kind of political climate limited this governor's ability or willingness to engage in broader types of criminal justice reforms and corrections. What we do see, though, is the election of Rod Blagojevich, who I believe is still in prison himself at this point, or maybe has recently been paroled, only recently. But Governor Blagojevich entered office after the previous Republican governor, but didn't run in any way on some sort of a campaign to fight mass incarceration, to make major criminal justice reforms a part of the administration. And instead, Blagojevich's administration focused on something else. The administration focused on essentially expanding in-prison drug treatment programs and creating kind of one of the largest prisons for drug treatment in the country. And also on trying to expand the ways that surveillance happened outside the prison when people were released. Rather than expanding reentry, the state of Illinois expanded the degree to which people were surveyed in an effort to focus on crime, reduction in public safety. So as we see here, Pennsylvania, I have a few quotes, and you don't have to read them exhaustively, but they give you an idea here about some of the things that some of these officials were trying to see. And as we can see here, as he was interviewed by the then Republican governor, the eventual head of the Pennsylvania Department of Corrections, the governor was already in Pennsylvania acknowledging that there was a problem and was willing to entertain potential reforms to the system because he understood that the current trajectory of the state wouldn't work. He said, look, I want you to take a look at this and see if there's some other things we can do. But the head of the DOC said, noted the problem, and this is a problem not of administrators or politicians, but it's kind of a social problem in our country that pervades our politics. As he said, our society wants to lock them up and forget they're there, prisoners. The problem is they are going to come home, they're going to come back, and that's what people don't like to think about. And it's important to remember that 90 to 95% of all inmates do return to the community. And part of what he was emphasizing is that it's easy politically to insist on these harsh penalties without recognizing the social reality that these people do come home. And that when they do, there's important problems that come with it. And the other thing that this person said is that with one of the programs that they were introducing for diverting people, one of the issues was that they had to placate the Prosecutors Association. He said, well, we had to keep a significant hammer hanging over people in the program over their head, that if they fail along the way, they go back to the judge for resentencing, where they could be resentenced up to the statutory max. So even when these reforms were being entertained in Pennsylvania, they came with caveats that essentially included the potential for more serious punishments. In Illinois, we had a different track. The governor's focus on essentially not dealing significantly with reducing the prison population led to a much more measured approach to dealing with the size and growth of the prison population. And one of the only people there who really engaged in some of these broader reforms, who have developed these programs inside of the prison, said that the changes you have to make, you can't really do through policy, you have to do them through management. So the idea here was that the changes couldn't be too highly politicized, that these changes essentially had to occur within the institutions themselves, where this person believed that was the only space in the Illinois correctional system where significant changes could happen. So if we look then at the trajectories of the two states, and we look at kind of the same time frame, we can see here and kind of cutting to the chase with the kind of the non-reform cases. We see that both of these states' incarceration rates increased significantly in the end. So while there was much to be gained in terms of limiting the size and expansion of prison populations in reform states, these two states continued on a trajectory that led to sharply escalating correctional budgets and some of those ongoing social and justice costs that we talked about in the beginning that are part of still a part of these states' correctional issues. And so then the question becomes, after looking at these kind of two cases of success with reform, two cases of failure of reform, one thing that became clear to us was that these penal administrators had played very significant roles in what happened in their states, but that what they were able to do was essentially operate within the system and in ways that weren't highly politicized. Governors didn't bring in these penal administrators and take them before the state legislature and pound the podium and say, I'm here to reduce our prison population. Instead, They noted that it cost too much. They noticed that it was overcrowded and unsustainable. And they brought in people who had the mindset that putting more and more people in prison wasn't the answer. And then they gave these people the autonomy to make their own decisions without facing intense political scrutiny from the legislature and thus from the public. So there's been a discussion in some academic circles about stealthy reforms. In other words, the only way to make some of these changes is to pass things that people don't really notice what they'll do in the long run. And we could debate whether that's even a good idea or not. But these weren't that. The public knew. Certainly there were vocal opposition. There were interest groups that were opposed to some of these changes. But these were not changes that operated in the center of the political sphere. And part of this is that it's important to understand that these administrators are a bit different than other people who are making decisions that affect mass incarceration. These administrators actually have to deal with the human beings that are in cages across their states. They have to manage the populations. They have to feed them. They have to care for them. They have to provide medical care. For these people, this is a much more human kind of connection to this process. And of course, they're detached and that they're working in state capitals. They're visiting with wardens in prisons. They're not in cells and hanging out with inmates on a regular basis. But the reality of it is that these administrators have to deal with the problems created by the more abstract legislative processes associated with sentencing. It's easy to sit here and say, I want 15 years for a sex offender. No, I want 25. I say give them 40, right? In an abstract sense, these are easy things to say. Those are much more difficult things to say for a prison administrator. Oh, you want to eliminate parole at all for all of these inmates? That sounds great. It makes you sound tough on crime. For a prison administrator, this is a massive headache, right? What could inmates have to look forward to if they know that there's no chance that they can be paroled, if they do the right things, if they do programming in prison? Major headaches for administrators. Not all administrators have been viewed historically as reformers. Many do fit the mold of what I stated. Their focus is simply on security and detention, right? But not all. There's a variety of types of administrators that we found, and when matched with governors, and governors pick them, so these are not random matches. These are people being appointed for reasons because they align with these interests. They can make a difference, and they did in these states. Had these officials been people who simply viewed their job in much more narrow terms of security and detention, then it's highly unlikely that the magnitude of changes that occurred in these states would have been the case. The other thing that we found is that one of the strategies for these reform-minded administrators in the correctional sphere was that they were able to do a lot of work in bringing together research to deploy and connections and networks to deploy to reinforce their correctional expertise. So one of the ways essentially that they were able to deflect some political criticisms of their efforts to expand parole, reduce the size of the prison population, was emphasizing that they were experts in what they did, and that they had research showing that recidivism is high is because we are not doing certain types of policies. That kind of expertise in reinforcing it helped sustain more of the autonomy that they had in the political sphere, and thus made them much more likely to be successful in the long run. And so if we think then about what are some of the kind of takeaways from these historical lessons of this period with these four states, there are several. And one is that many of the arguments are, well, the one thing that can really affect mass incarceration, so it's just so expensive that eventually states are going to have to do something else because it costs so much, especially when the economy tanks. We found that's not true. Pennsylvania kept spending lots of money. Actually, all the states kept spending money. But at the end of the day, economic crises may open windows to reconsider existing policies, but it's not a sufficient factor to lead to declines in prison populations. We also know the administrators did play a key role in these processes. And we know that having flexibility and changing institutional processes at the back end did matter. The states that had the ability to make those changes did more than the states that couldn't, and it had a long-term major impact on these things. We also know that at the end, and this isn't news, this isn't shocking, but that the governor's support, the executive branch is essential. If you want to really shape state policy, governors, whether it's a strong governorship in some states or a weaker one in others, governors can set the political agenda. They can politicize things that they don't want to support. They can keep things quiet and more so than other groups than those that don't. But at the end of the day, kind of even Republican governors who hadn't, and Democratic governors that hadn't run on crime, these people understood that they had to manage these populations. And lastly, then these early changes matter in the big picture. Is again, I don't have the time to go on and on. I've already gone on plenty long enough. But these early changes essentially became baby steps that helped set the stage and shift the context and the institutional context at the state level that opened up windows for the types of reforms later that had a much broader reach, much broader consequence, and had important implications for people in Michigan and New Jersey that didn't happen for people that lived in Illinois and Pennsylvania. So.
Okay, so I'll let you field in-person questions, and then there might be some online questions as well. But does anybody have a question?
All right, sounds great. So, there's some questions. Yes.
Start with a question that probably really isn't fair to you and asking you to sort of project findings forward for today's world. So you said politics interfere but don't motivate. So I'm curious, based on this research and what you've done, sort of looking at more recent years, to what extent do you think that means to the current push for reform post 2020, which is often loud, more political, will be successful? Like, is the not stealthy but not loud sort of condition necessary in your mind for there to be meaningful and impactful reform, or are there circumstances under which the loud model is effective?
It's a great question, and I have a slide prepared for this very question because it's the right question, right? Part of the question here would be if historical forces like 9/11 and a recession help move the needle and create new windows, what did 2020 do in the current political context that we live in? What did it do, and how relevant are those lessons to today? And I would say one of the lessons about penal administrators, which, let's be honest, this is not a group of people that people would think of as kind of leaders of reform, right? This is people often would look at these people as part of the problem. And I guess my response to that would be when you're taking on a kind of a problem of this scope and scale that is so deeply institutionally entrenched. I think it's a little naive to think that simply through political pressure are you going to be able to address this. I think that from, and this is again coming from not just this project, but from a broader reading and research, it's going to take measures inside the state and outside the state. And, the state is not some anonymous entity. It's made up of human beings that make decisions every day, right? Mass incarceration was not created by some force that descended on the United States in the 1970s and said, you must build prisons and put 500% more people in prison than you did in the past. These are human beings making decisions on a daily basis. And there's people making decisions inside and out. So what I would say is at that time, in that moment, kind of the loud politicized decisions weren't likely to be successful. And they weren't. There were people, there's always people that have called for and identified these problems, right? And have called for a different path. Like there's always people who have understood the injustices that how this disproportionately falls on people of color, poor people that don't graduate from high school in particular. But the problem is during certain times, politicizing these things seem to undermine and undercut the likelihood that you'd be successful, because then efforts in the grant home administration being politicized would have been a problem. Today, I would say the country's so polarized that your comment would depend on the state you're in. A state like California, a more politicized, kind of inside and out at the same time, where the state and the politics align much more closely with a commitment to reform, that's much more likely. But I would say in those states that have the highest incarceration rates in the country, that kind of approach is still going to face serious uphill battles. And, my view is, we can't celebrate the successes in California or Colorado or New Jersey or Massachusetts without acknowledging the massive failures in Mississippi, in Louisiana, that continue. There's so many people there that are still going to prison. There's very little interest in rethinking in a serious way what's happening with mass incarceration in those places. So there's things that we can learn, you know, in California, and much to learn too. But we have to understand this is a big country and that every state has a very different political context. And what works here won't work there. But we can't forget that there's a lot of work, more work to be done in some ways in those places than here. The answers aren't going to be simple, but they have to start at acknowledging and understanding the importance of the state context itself. Now,
Other questions in here?
I have a question for Zoom. This is from an anonymous attendee. Did the total carceral population, prison, jail, parole, probation, and diversion, for the states listed in your study also show a similar 20% reduction?
so probation and parole, in addition to prisoners,
In addition to prison, jail,
the answer to that is no. So what we end up with in Michigan is we end up with mass parole instead of mass incarceration. Michelle Phelps, who's at the University of Minnesota, has done a lot of work studying probation in Michigan. And a lot of that work shows that as probation also became more robust, it also became more problematic, right? You can do probation much cheaper, so you can do it to even more people and expand surveillance from the state and expand your control over certain populations. So the answer to that is no, right? The overall correctional kind of footprint in these states didn't completely shrink. But I guess from my perspective, the view would be you have to start somewhere, and people not being in these institutions that we know fester disease. They undermine later life success. They cause more problems than they solve. They make it more likely, not less, that you'll be homeless or that you'll re-engage in criminal activity in the future. Them not being in prison, I'm not saying that probation or mass probation are great ideas, but I am saying that I think that getting fewer bodies in cages in the United States is a good first step. But this isn't some big happy success story. The other thing I'll say is the people who are left in those prisons. So, and I should have said this up front, reducing a prison population from the perspective of this nice air-conditioned room in here sounds great. But what it really means for inmates, for many inmates, is that the ones that remain in those prisons now get packed into even fewer facilities when certain facilities are closed. When those costs come down, what it often means is programming is the first thing that gets cut. Life in prison gets worse if you're one of those people who are still there. 5,000 fewer people may be in prison, but for those people who still are, conditions may be even worse than they were before. So this notion of tearing down the carceral state, like starting or defund mass incarceration. The reality for inmates, if you do that, and when we look at Southern prisons in particular, where the cost per inmate is very low through prison labor, right? Through the types of conditions that occur there. This is, and I'm not blaming the South. There's plenty of horrible conditions in plenty of other states across the country, but it's just been better documented there. The reality of it is fewer bodies is a step. But to lose focus on the actual conditions that remain for people who are still incarcerated means you're missing a big part of the story. My story is not one of prison conditions and consequences of these things. It's more about the shift in the political context. The realities on the ground aren't rosy for those people who are still in prison.
I have more Zoom questions. This is from another anonymous attendee. For the last few decades, the messaging of law and order and being tough on crime have caused a public want for mass incarceration. Do you think this messaging is weakening, and will it soon be politically feasible to not have to be kind of stealthy to promote reform?
Well, it's debatable, the first part of the statement, as to whether the law and order politics that this person is referring to has directly caused these things. I don't know that you can simply say that. I'd say the American public in many contexts have been very receptive to these things. And so as somebody who once probably would have made that argument, I would have to say that it's a little more complex than simply saying that politicians and the media stirred up a bunch of fake concerns about violence and crime. I think the nation's relationship with violence, I was talking to some graduate students earlier and undergraduate students at a meeting earlier, and I was saying, one of the issues here with our incarceration is the United States fundamentally different than other countries? Is this a story of American exceptionalism, right? Mass incarceration, we incarcerate people at rates that don't even fit on charts with countries that we're comparable to. But our rates of homicide are similar, right? Our rates of gun ownership and gun usage and gun deaths are similar, whether it's suicide, accidental, or homicide, whatever it may be. We're exceptional on a lot of these things. And so the question about these things, I think, runs deeper than the American public kind of being kind of the certain latent racist anger stirred up and focused on building more prisons. It's part of the problem. That's there. But I think it's rooted in a much more deeper element of American history, of American politics, and kind of unresolved issues about, you know, who does and doesn't belong in our country. And I think until you address those things, I think that the political energy and the ability to win elections in places where we really need people to win elections, like Alabama, Mississippi, and Louisiana, there's got to be more of a reckoning with where this comes from. And it comes from our nation's racial history, and you can't ignore that. Look at the prisons in Louisiana. Right? Watch the documentary The Farm about the one prison in Louisiana. And it's essentially a modern day plantation.
Other questions from anyone here?
I have another Zoom question. From another anonymous attendee. Correctional administrators must serve under the umbrella of the legislature and governor's office. Likewise, under policies and existing law. What specific activities did you find that can allow Californians to be independent influencers for changes that could impact recidivism?
Allow who?
Allow California.
California. So what policies specifically?
And activities.
And activities. Well, examples from these states are just that when we think of the activities, the day-to-day activities that people involved in correctional administration engage in, I think we all understand, whether you're a professor working in a university, you feel like you are bound by certain constraints, right? I think I have to teach my class by starting it off with droning on in a 45-minute lecture, then having a discussion, and then maybe looking at it. I don't have to do that. It isn't written down anywhere, right? But it's still what I do. I do it because this is part of the cultural and institutional processes that I've learned. And I think part of what's important to remember here is that institutions can change by reinforcing and incentivizing behaviors and activities that move away from those things that are problematic and move toward things that are more constructive. When you incentivize and think about parole success, for example, you can't just think this parole officer is a failure. He had 6 of his people reoffended over the course of the last month. Well, maybe 6 reoffended, but maybe the same parole officer also had 20 people who otherwise might have been homeless, who otherwise might have been unemployed, who this person was able to successfully help because they distributed their efforts in ways that generally lifted the well-being of the entire group. Those sorts of activities, reinforcing those kinds of approaches and shifting the institutional meters and culture, those are the sorts of things that, you know, can happen on the ground that you can't do through policy. You know, I think of the book, Michael Lipsky's book, Street Level Bureaucrats, that, you know, if you think about policing on the ground, you can have all these trainings, you can do all these different things that you want. But at the end of the day, there are going to be officers on the ground and their supervisor is not going to be over their shoulder, and no one's going to know, even with cameras and recordings, how they're really approaching their day-to-day job. Part of this is building cultures where those officers and where those penal administrators, where their goal really is to help inmates not come back to prison, help them get out sooner, and help them not just not reoffend, but how about helping them have better lives when they get out, not die of a drug overdose within 60 days when they leave prison, not be homeless, right? Help them have better lives. So failure should be redefined. The culture and the institutional processes that are part of it should be redefined too.
I have one last question. We're almost out of time, but it relates to what you're talking about. So I'm thinking about more middle range administrators, like you were, that have discretion. You were talking about like DAs, prosecuting attorneys, judges. So what role does that, how big of a role, I should say, does that play? You talked about governors having a lot of discretion in some of these things, or wardens potentially, right? So what about these kind of middle tiered folks, and like how much impact could they potentially have, or do they have?
I think they have a lot of impact. I think prosecutors would fit that. If we think of are you asking me about correction systems specifically, or are you talking about the criminal justice system more broadly?
Both. I mean, either one, whichever one.
Yeah. I think I would prefer to just speak, as we live in a context where there's this ongoing angst about criminal justice reform, and for good reason. I think that they're essential. I think that these mid-level managers, whether it be a prison warden, who sets the context for what life is going to be like in this facility, what's going to be prioritized, what types of guards are going to become managers, what types of accountability. And I have another slide here, or another point here, accountability, right? Like, it's not okay to have a parole officer who's just looking to nail them, right? How do you set the tone with these things? Well, it's leadership. You have to have the right kind of leaders doing these things. And part of that becomes with how do you recruit. I say to my students, like, you want to change the criminal justice system, one thing you could do is work in it, right? Like, if we have college graduates who think that the system should be different, who actually go and try to work in these systems, maybe there would be some sort of critical mass of interest in running them differently, fundamentally running them differently. And there is enough social and cultural capital for that to happen in places like California. So I do think they matter. I know prosecutors matter a lot, right? Prosecutors have meetings with their deputy prosecutors and they say, hey, we're not focusing on A, B, and C that much, but D, E, and F are going to be a big part of the kind of cases that we're going to dedicate more time to. That kind of discretion is unavoidable in the systems that we have. And I feel like that mid-tier leadership is an essential component of it. And it's certainly true, wardens can really set the tone. They have a lot of control, and deputy wardens in a prison, they have a lot of power. I would say the same for like juvenile detention facilities. What kind of person do you have leading that place? Do they care about the kids? Or are they there because they just think, well, I can make a lot more money being in a detention facility and these kids are all trouble anyway, so I don't have to work on the teaching. Well, figure out who those people are, hold them accountable, and get the right kind of people in leadership.
Great. Well, thank you so much. Really interesting talk. Thanks everyone for coming.
Yeah, thanks everybody. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Anybody visibly not on?
I know.